Steps of Wisdom. Breaking the Chains of the Past, Part 1. The Roots of Defeat, Chapter 1. A House of Dreams, with Dialogue. The house stood at the edge of the field, its walls weathered by years of wind and rain, the bricks no longer holding the shine they once did. To a passerby, it looked like any other house in the countryside, but for Jonathan, it was the site of countless dreams deferred. His parents had built this house with the optimism of youth, the kind of blind hope that only exists before life has had its way with you. Jonathan sat on the porch, the wood creaking beneath him, his gaze fixed on the hills that rolled gently into the distance. His father used to say those hills held promise, that beyond them lay opportunity, a life free from the constraints of the past. But for as long as Jonathan could remember, those hills remained out of reach, always obscured by the weight of his family's mistakes. "Look at those hills, John," his father, Daniel, would say, his voice full of a kind of forced enthusiasm that Jonathan had come to recognize as desperation. "One day, we'll make it over there, and life will be different. Better." Jonathan didn't respond when his father said those words. He had learned early on that silence was easier. It avoided the conflict that simmered beneath the surface of Daniel's hope. Now, as he sat on the same porch, he could still hear the echo of his father's voice in the wind, promising change that never came. Inside, the old clock in the hallway ticked, its rhythmic grind a constant reminder of how time moved on, even when the people in this house did not. It had been Ruth's clock, a wedding gift from Daniel's mother, who had insisted it would bring good fortune. But the clock had never been a source of luck. Instead, it had become a symbol of lost time, the seconds ticking away on dreams that would never come to pass. Jonathan rose and entered the house, the scent of dust and old wood heavy in the air. The floor creaked under his feet, the same way it had for as long as he could remember. In the dim light of the kitchen, he saw the letter, crumpled, yellowed at the edges, and untouched for years. His father had once clutched that letter with the same fervor he'd held onto every ill-conceived plan. Jonathan picked up the letter, turning it over in his hands. The words on the page felt like a weight he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the paper itself that held power, but what it represented. A choice, a step taken without thought, without circumspection. His father had signed his name without considering the consequences. Jonathan, on the other hand, had learned to weigh every decision like a stone in his hand, feeling its weight before deciding whether to cast it or keep it. His mother's voice broke through his thoughts. "Jonathan, you don't need to go down the same path as your father." He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face etched with years of worry. Ruth had always been the anchor, the one who tried to hold the family together as Daniel's ambitions pulled them apart. Even now, she looked at him with concern, as if afraid that he would follow in his father's footsteps. "I know, Mom," he said softly, placing the letter back on the table. "I'm not." Ruth crossed the room and sat beside him, her hands folding into her lap. "It's hard, you know? Watching everything fall apart. But you're different, Jonathan. You've always been different." Jonathan looked at his mother, the lines on her face a roadmap of years spent trying to pick up the pieces of his father's failed plans. "I just don't understand why he couldn't see it," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why he kept making the same mistakes." Ruth sighed, her eyes drifting to the window where the sun was setting behind the hills Daniel had always dreamed of. "Your father, he wanted so much, too much. He thought if he reached far enough, something would change. But he never took the time to think things through." Jonathan nodded. "I won't be like that. I can't be." Ruth smiled softly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "You're careful, Jonathan. You always have been. But don't be afraid to take a step when you know it's the right one." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees in the distance. Jonathan watched as the branches swayed, bending but never breaking. He had always admired their resilience. His father had often spoken about strength, about how it took courage to take risks. But Jonathan had come to understand a different kind of strength, the strength to wait, to observe, to make the right choice even when the wrong one seemed easier. "You don't think I'm being too careful?" he asked, glancing at his mother. She shook her head. "No, I think you're being wise. But wisdom doesn't mean never acting. It means knowing when to act and when to wait. Jonathan considered her words. He had always been cautious, measuring each decision against the weight of his father's failures. But his mother was right. There was a balance between recklessness and hesitation, between jumping too soon and never jumping at all. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field, Jonathan's thoughts drifted to his own future. He didn't know what lay beyond the hills, but he knew one thing for certain: he would not repeat the mistakes of the past. His parents' lives had been marked by haste, by a desire to reach something just out of sight. Jonathan would move carefully, with intention, each step measured against the weight of generations. "You'll find your way, Jonathan," Ruth said, her voice soft but steady. "I believe in you." Jonathan looked at her, a quiet resolve settling in his chest. "I won't let you down." Ruth reached out, placing her hand gently on his. "You never could." The wind carried the faint sound of the clock ticking inside the house, a reminder that time marched on. But for Jonathan, there was no rush. He had learned that sometimes the greatest victories came not from racing ahead, but from walking circumspectly, carefully avoiding the pitfalls that had trapped those before him. In the quiet of the evening, Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The past might have built the foundation of his life, but it did not have to determine his future. With each cautious step, he was breaking the chains that had bound his parents. He was forging a new path, one built not on blind hope, but on wisdom and patience. And with that, he knew, he would overcome what had once defeated them. The old clock ticked on, but this time, Jonathan wasn't listening. He was moving forward, but on his own terms. Chapter 2. Cracks in the foundation. The house groaned as the wind swept across the open field, pushing against the walls that had stood for decades. Inside, the air felt still, as if waiting for something to break. Jonathan stood at the window, watching the storm gather in the distance. The dark clouds reminded him of the weight that had always hung over his family, silent, unseen, but heavy. His father, Daniel, had once been the kind of man who faced storms with defiance. "You can't wait forever," Daniel had often said. "If you wait too long, the world will pass you by." Jonathan had heard those words countless times growing up, usually just before his father made another rushed decision. That was how they ended up here, in a house that felt more like a monument to missed opportunities than a home. The first time Jonathan noticed the cracks was when he was just a boy. The floorboards had started to give way, and the walls, once sturdy, had begun to shift. He remembered the night it all started, the moment when the foundation of the family, both the house and the people inside it, began to crumble. He had been sitting at the dinner table, pushing the food around on his plate. His mother, Ruth, was standing at the sink, her back tense, shoulders hunched forward as though the weight of the entire house had fallen onto her. Daniel sat across from Jonathan, drumming his fingers on the table. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house. "I've got it all figured out," Daniel finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was confident, almost too confident, as if he needed to convince himself just as much as the rest of them. "This new deal, it's going to change everything." Ruth turned slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. Her eyes were tired, worn from years of hearing promises that never came true. "Daniel, we've talked about this," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of caution. "We can't afford another gamble. We're already behind on the mortgage." Jonathan watched as his father's face hardened. He had seen that look before, the one that signaled his father had already made up his mind. "Ruth, this is the only way out," Daniel said, his voice rising. "We can't keep doing the same thing and expect things to get better. Sometimes you have to take risks." Ruth's gaze shifted to Jonathan, her eyes softening as if she didn't want him to see the cracks in their marriage, in their family. "It's not about taking risks, Daniel. It's about taking the right ones." Jonathan glanced at the doorframe, where a small fissure had appeared weeks earlier. His father had promised to fix it, but like so many things, it remained undone, a silent testament to all that had been neglected. "You don't understand," Daniel said, shaking his head. "Sometimes you have to jump. If we don't do this now, we'll be stuck here forever." Ruth opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she turned back to the sink, the clatter of dishes filling the room like the sound of dreams breaking. Jonathan stayed quiet, his eyes moving from his mother's slumped shoulders to the determination etched on his father's face. In that moment, he made a promise to himself: he would not be like his father. He would not let impatience and ambition blind him to the cracks forming beneath his feet. In the weeks that followed, Daniel went forward with his plans. Another business venture, another loan taken out in haste. Jonathan could hear the arguments late at night, the words that cut through the walls like knives. Ruth would plead for caution, but Daniel's voice was always louder, drowning out reason with the force of his conviction. And then, like a storm breaking over the hills, it all came crashing down. The deal that was supposed to save them instead brought ruin. The loan defaulted, the business partners disappeared, and the house that had once been a symbol of hope, was now a weight around their necks. Jonathan remembered the day the foreclosure notice arrived. He had been sitting on the porch, just like now, watching the same hills his father used to talk about. The letter was thin, its contents heavier than the paper itself. He had watched his father open it, watched the way his shoulders sagged as the words registered. It was the first time Jonathan had ever seen his father look defeated. Later that night, Jonathan found his mother sitting alone at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second passing like a heartbeat that was slowly fading. "We're going to lose the house," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was always going to end like this. Jonathan sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. He was just a boy then, too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, but old enough to feel the cracks widening. "We'll be fine," he had said, echoing the words his father had often used. But even then, he didn't believe them. His mother looked at him with eyes that held years of disappointment. "Jonathan, you're different. You don't have to make the same mistakes." That night, as the wind howled outside and the house creaked under the pressure, Jonathan made another promise to himself. He would walk carefully, step by step, ensuring that each choice he made was measured and thoughtful. He would not be rushed by ambition, nor would he be paralyzed by fear. The cracks that had formed in his parents' lives did not have to define his own. Now, as an adult, Jonathan stood in the same house, staring at the same hills. The storm was closer now, the sky darkening. But Jonathan didn't feel the same dread he once had. He had learned to walk carefully, to examine every choice before stepping forward. And in doing so, he had begun to break the chains of the past. The house might still creak, and the wind might still howl, but Jonathan knew that he was not his father. He would not let the cracks defeat him. He would move forward, with wisdom and patience, one step at a time. And this time, the foundation would hold. Chapter 3. The child's eyes. Jonathan was young, but his eyes took in more than anyone realized. He had learned early to watch quietly from the corners of rooms, where the light barely touched and where the adults never looked. He didn't understand everything that happened around him, not yet, but he knew enough to sense the tension that lived in the walls of the house. It was something that lingered in the space between words, in the silence that stretched after his parents stopped speaking. He sat on the floor in the living room, his toys scattered around him, but he wasn't playing. His eyes were on his father, Daniel, who stood by the kitchen window, staring out as if searching for something just beyond the horizon. The shadows under his father's eyes had deepened lately, and there was a certain tightness in his voice that made Jonathan's stomach churn. He could hear his mother, Ruth, in the next room, her footsteps light but hurried as she moved about, always working, always doing. Jonathan's gaze shifted to the clock on the wall. It was an old thing, its face cracked, and its hands moved slowly, sluggishly, as if it had grown tired of marking the passage of time. The ticking was faint but persistent, like the heartbeat of the house itself. It was a sound that always reminded Jonathan of something he couldn't quite name, something like waiting, like holding your breath just before something important happens. "Jonathan," his father's voice broke through the ticking, rough and worn. "Come here." Jonathan stood up, hesitating for a moment before crossing the room to stand beside his father. He looked up, searching his father's face for some kind of answer, though he wasn't sure what the question was. Daniel didn't look at him right away. His eyes were still fixed on the horizon. "Do you ever wonder what's out there?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Do you think there's something better waiting for us?" Jonathan didn't know what to say. He looked out the window, too, but all he saw were the fields, stretching on and on under the gray sky. He shrugged, feeling the weight of his father's question even though he didn't understand it. His father sighed, his breath fogging up the glass. "You'll understand one day," he said, almost to himself. "This place, it's not enough. It's never been enough." Jonathan shifted on his feet, glancing back toward the kitchen where his mother was still moving about. He felt the pull of something he couldn't name, the quiet ache in his chest that came whenever his father spoke like this, about things too big for Jonathan to grasp but too heavy to ignore. "I don't know, Dad," Jonathan said after a long pause, his voice small. I think maybe it's okay." Daniel chuckled, a soft, bitter sound that made Jonathan's heart sink. "Okay," he repeated, shaking his head. "Maybe for you, but not for me." His father turned away from the window, his eyes finally landing on Jonathan. There was something there, something dark and restless, something that made Jonathan feel like he had missed something important, like there was a part of the world he wasn't old enough to see yet. He felt the distance between them, the space that was more than just physical, and he wanted to close it, but he didn't know how. "Your mother," Daniel began, his voice low, "she thinks everything can stay the way it is. She doesn't understand what's out there, what we could have if we just—" He cut himself off, shaking his head again. "Never mind." Jonathan looked up at him, frowning. He didn't understand why his father was so unhappy. They had everything they needed, didn't they? A house, a family, food on the table. He wanted to ask, but the words tangled in his throat. Just then, Ruth entered the room, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. She glanced at Jonathan and then at Daniel, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she could sense the conversation she hadn't overheard. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her voice light, but Jonathan could hear the edge to it. It was the same tone she used when something wasn't quite right but she didn't want to talk about it. "Come and help set the table, Jonathan." Jonathan nodded and slipped away from his father's side, glad for an excuse to leave the strange, heavy atmosphere that always seemed to follow his father these days. As he gathered the plates and silverware, he listened to the quiet between his parents, the way they didn't speak but communicated all the same. He heard his father shift in the living room, pacing like he often did when he was thinking. His mother stood at the stove, stirring something, her movements sharp and efficient. There was no room for mistakes in the way she moved, as if she could hold the world together by sheer force of will. Jonathan placed the plates on the table carefully, his small hands steady but thoughtful. He had learned early on to be careful, to walk lightly, to listen to the silence as much as the words. As they sat down to dinner, Jonathan noticed the crack in the ceiling above the table, a small fissure that had appeared sometime during the last winter. His father had promised to fix it, but like so many things, it had been left alone, growing wider with each passing month. Jonathan stared at it, his food untouched, and wondered if all cracks started small, barely noticeable, before they became too big to ignore. His mother's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Eat, Jonathan," she said gently, though her eyes were on his father. He picked up his fork and took a bite, chewing slowly as he felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. He didn't understand everything yet, but he knew one thing. Something was broken here, something deep, and he wasn't sure how to fix it. All he knew was that he had to walk carefully, to watch and listen and learn. One day, he would understand. And when that day came, he would make sure he didn't repeat the same mistakes. As the clock on the wall ticked on, Jonathan vowed to step lightly, to be thoughtful in ways his father couldn't be. It was the only way to break free of the past that had weighed them down for so long.